6 months before a land filing quietly erased a black settlement from the records of Yalobusha County. 70 armed white men rode toward that settlement in the dark, not to threaten it, not to frighten it, to erase it. They expected a village of farmers, a church, a school, a mill, families asleep. Children too young to know that the world had already decided it resented their freedom. What they did not expect was that 10 of the men living in that village had once worn the uniform of the United States Army. 10 men trained to survive frontier war. 10 men who had spent years learning how to hold ground against larger numbers. 10 men who had come to Mississippi to stop fighting and were forced to pick up the night one last time. By dawn, 31 of the attackers would not ride out again. Their leader would be found face down in black marsh water at the edge of the village, and the quiet black settlement they came to destroy would still be standing. This is the story of Sorrows Bluff, a place the county wanted gone because it proved something dangerous, that free black people did not need permission to build something beautiful. Yalobusha County, Mississippi, October 1877. The federal troops were gone. Reconstruction was dying. And across the South, black communities were learning a brutal lesson all at once. Freedom on paper and safety in the world were not the same thing. Sorrows Bluff sat on 400 acres of Mississippi bottomland. Most white landowners had dismissed as useless. The ground flooded twice a year. The soil fought every crop. The mosquitoes were relentless. The roads became mud whenever the rain decided it had somewhere to be. By every impatient measure, it was bad land, which is exactly why black families had been allowed to buy it, because white men looked at hard land and saw no future in it. The people who settled Sorrows Bluff looked at that same ground and saw something else. A chance. They had spent their lives working land for other people, digging drainage, learning flood patterns, reading the soil with the kind of knowledge a man acquires when his body has been forced into labor year after year. They knew what this land demanded. Patience, discipline, endurance. They had all three. By 1877, Sorrows Bluff was no longer an experiment. It was a living village. A church stood at its center with a bell, rescued from the ruins of a plantation house that had burned after the war. Every Sunday that bell rang across the bottomland like a declaration. Not just that service was starting, but that something had survived. There was a schoolhouse, too. One room, 43 students, and a teacher named Miss Ida, who had come from Memphis with a trunk full of books and the kind of stubborn love that can turn learning into resistance. The children at Sorrows Bluff were hungry for words. Hungry in the way children get when they understand, even before they can say it plainly, that literacy is a door no one can close once it opens. Miss Ida had planned to stay 1 year. She stayed because leaving felt too much like helping the world remain what it had always been. The mill gave the village its heartbeat. It processed corn not just for Sorrows Bluff, but for surrounding farms and settlements. It made money, real money, enough that county officials began paying attention, enough that white landowners began talking about the village with that particular bitterness reserved for black success. Because poverty could be tolerated, dependence could be tolerated, but black prosperity, black order, black ownership, those things unsettled people who had spent their lives believing freedom would fail if it were ever truly tested. At the edge of that mill lived a man named Solomon Gray, 44 years old, broad-shouldered, quiet, a widower, a man who kept a garden and repaired machinery and spoke only when he had something worth saying. To the village, He was simply a capable man who knew how to build and fix and endure. What almost no one outside a small circle knew was that Solomon Gray had once been a soldier of the 10th Cavalry, a buffalo soldier. He had spent years on the frontier doing work he never described in detail. He had seen enough violence to last several lifetimes. And when he came to Sorrows Bluff, one clear intention: to be done with war. He was not the only one. 9 other men in the village carried the same kind of silence. A ferryman, a carpenter, a preacher, a hunter, a mechanic. Ordinary men in ordinary roles. But beneath that ordinary life sat old training, frontier training, military reflex, the kind of knowledge that never fully leaves the body. They had not advertised who they were. That was deliberate. Men survive longer in dangerous places when their enemies misjudge them. And Sorrows Bluff had been underestimated for 3 years. Then, in August of 1877, the county sent a message, a tax notice, legal language, carefully worded, polite on the surface, threat underneath. Solomon read it once, then again, folded it, put it in his coat pocket. That evening, he visited 9 doors. No speeches, no alarm, just the quiet beginning of men understanding that the county had finally decided. Sorrows Bluff had lived long enough. Aldous Greer did not think of himself as a violent man. That is important to understand. Not because it excuses anything, it does not, but because men who enjoy violence are often careless. Aldous Greer was not careless. He was patient, organized, and convinced he was correcting something the world had gotten wrong. He was 56 years old in the fall of 1877, born into the Mississippi planter class, raised to believe land was not simply property, but proof of who mattered, proof of who ruled, proof of whose future counted. His father had owned hundreds of acres, his grandfather more than that. And for men like Greer, power had always felt natural, like weather, like gravity, like something too fundamental to ever truly disappear. Then the war came, and the world changed. Not all at once, not cleanly, but enough. Enough that the old certainty cracked. Enough that men like Aldous Greer began waking each day in a country that no longer arranged itself entirely around their comfort. He had served in Confederate cavalry. He came home with his house still standing, but the system that had made his life profitable was broken. Labor was no longer guaranteed. Credit had tightened. Fields that once produced wealth now demanded wages. And worst of all, in Greer's mind, black people were building lives that did not require his permission. He watched Sorrows Bluff rise on land white surveyors had called useless. He watched families clear flood ground and make it hold. He watched a church bell ring where no planter had ordered one rung. He watched children learning to read in a school built by people who, in his view, were never supposed to become landowners, mill operators, or anything that looked like citizens. He watched the village file taxes, turn a profit, appear on county ledgers not as labor, but as ownership. And he took every bit of that personally. To the people of Sorrows Bluff, the village was proof of dignity. To Aldous Greer, it was proof of defiance. An insult in timber and cornmeal and church bells. A visible reminder that black people, left to themselves, might build something stable, something prosperous, something independent. And men like Greer could tolerate many things, but not that. So he organized, not publicly, not foolishly, and not under masks. Greer had no respect for theatrical terror. He preferred structure. What he built over 18 months was cleaner than a mob and more dangerous because of it. 70 men, former soldiers, local farmers, dispossessed whites who blamed black ownership for every collapse in their own fortunes. A county deputy who would never officially be connected to what was coming. Men who did not need robes or ritual to justify themselves, only grievance, money, and a leader willing to pay for both. He drilled them 3 times on his property. Officially, they were militia exercises, civic defense, voluntary training, respectable words for something rotten. He drew maps, assigned fire teams, planned routes, studied Sorrows Bluff through riders who passed the village at different hours, pretending to be ordinary travelers. And every report that came back reassured him. No visible weapons, no fortifications, no military organization, just a black village doing ordinary work and believing ordinary life would save it. Greer mistook peace for weakness. That was his fatal mistake. 4 days before the attack, a 19-year-old boy named Reuben Clay arrived at Greer's property with a wagon load of feed corn. He was not a soldier, not a hero, not a man anyone in the county would have picked out as important. He was simply a farmer's son, reliable, quiet, used to minding his business, used to surviving Mississippi by noticing exactly what should be noticed, and pretending not to notice the rest. He had made this delivery before. Unload the feed, get the receipt, drive home. Routine. That evening would have been no different, except that as Reuben moved past the barn, voices drifted through a gap in the boards. He did not stop at first. He only slowed. Then he heard 3 words that changed everything. Sorrows Bluff. 70 men. Full dark. Reuben stood in the shadows beside his father's wagon and listened. He heard enough. Enough to understand that this was not intimidation, not a raid for supplies, not another act of petty harassment meant to frighten free black families back into dependence. This was extermination dressed up as order. Burn the mill, burn the school, break the village, file the land claim by morning. Reuben did not wait to hear more. He left the wagon, left the receipt, left everything except what mattered. The details. He repeated them in his mind as he moved. Date, number, route, time. Not because he was brave, because he understood with cold, immediate clarity that details were the only weapon he had. And if he lost even one, people would die. He got to the gate without running. There were mounted watchers near the western line. Any sudden movement would draw attention. So he walked like a boy finishing an ordinary job. Past the gate, past the open stretch, past the point where being seen would still mean being caught. Then he hit the tree line and ran. The distance between Greer's western edge and Sorrows Bluff was 4 miles. Not road miles, swamp miles, black water, cypress roots, mud that could take a boot clean off your foot if you chose wrong. Reuben had grown up fishing those waters. He knew where the ground held and where it vanished. He ran through places no horse could follow cleanly, water up to his thighs, then his waist, branches clawing his face, mud sucking at his legs. He kept the details in his head the entire time. 70 men, 4 days, full dark, burn what burns. He was a mile into the swamp when the shot came. One of Greer's outer riders had spotted movement and fired blind into the darkness. The bullet grazed the top of Reuben's left shoulder, hot, sharp, enough to sting his whole arm numb for a second. He stumbled, but did not stop. Stopping was death. He angled deeper into the swamp where the trees closed overhead, and the night became almost complete. The pain clarified him. He ran harder. By the time he reached Sorrows Bluff, his shirt was soaked with marsh water and blood. He found Solomon Gray's house and barely had time to knock. Solomon opened the door before his hand landed. He had heard the approach. Reuben spoke for 4 straight minutes. No pauses, no dramatics, just facts. The date, the number, the route the riders would take, the names of the men he recognized. The phrase he had heard exactly as Greer's men used it. Burn what burns. He repeated the number twice. 70. 70 armed men. Solomon listened without interrupting. When Reuben finished, Solomon asked only 2 questions, both about the road, both about the route. Reuben answered both. Solomon nodded once, put a hand on the boy's good shoulder, and thanked him with the plain seriousness of a man who understood what that run had cost. Then he sent him inside to have the wound looked at. After that, Solomon stood alone on his porch for a moment in the dark. Not long, just long enough to do the mathematics. 10 trained men, 4 days, 70 attackers. A village full of people who believed they had built enough goodness to be left alone. He looked toward the church, then toward the mill, then down the road that would soon carry death toward both. And finally, he stepped off the porch, walked into the night, and began knocking on 9 doors. No one in Sorrows Bluff asked why Solomon Gray was knocking on their door after dark. Men who had spent years on the frontier learned to read the weight in another man's face. They opened the door. They saw it immediately, and they came. Within an hour, 10 men stood inside the church. The candles on the altar were the only light. Outside, the village was quiet. Inside, Solomon laid the facts on the table the same way Reuben had given them. 70 men, 4 days, night attack, burn the mill, burn the school, take the land. When he finished, he said nothing else. He simply sat down on the front pew and let the room breathe. Because men like these did not need speeches. They needed truth and time. Marcus Hale spoke first. 37 years old, former corporal, now the village's best carpenter. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. 70 men, he said quietly. 10 of us. He did not raise his voice. He did not soften the numbers. Those aren't numbers you fight, he paused. They're numbers you move your people away from. Several men nodded, because Marcus was not wrong. Every soldier in that room had survived the frontier by understanding one rule above all others. You do not defend ground you cannot hold. You retreat. You live. You fight somewhere better. Eli Pratt spoke next. 40 years old, former quartermaster, a man whose military life had been built on logistics and survival. Meet them on the road, he said. No weapons showing. Ask for terms. Even as he said it, he understood the weakness in the idea. But sometimes a man has to speak the thought that is sitting in his chest, just so it stops sitting there. No one answered him. The silence in the church was not anger. It was recognition. They all knew what those men were coming to do. Negotiation was not part of the plan. Against the back wall stood Apprentice Wade, 19 years old, the youngest man in the room, the only one who had never fought in a real war. He had followed Solomon to Sorrows Bluff 3 years earlier, learning mill work and whatever pieces of discipline older men chose to pass down. No one spoke to him directly, but everyone in the room knew he was listening harder than anyone else, because this night would decide the shape of the rest of his life. Solomon still had not spoken. He sat in the front pew, forearms resting on his knees, looking down at the floorboards between his boots. A candle flame moved slightly in a draft behind him. His shadow stretched across the church floor like a long, dark road. He had spent 11 years in the cavalry. He had made decisions in darkness before, decisions that ended lives, decisions that saved them, decisions that followed him long after the shooting stopped. When he left the army, he had nailed his uniform coat into a trunk and closed the lid. That was his promise to himself. No more war, no more killing, no more nights that demanded a man choose who lived and who did not. He had built a house, planted a garden, attended church, fixed machinery, tried to learn what quiet felt like. And now the quiet was over, not because he had asked for it, because the world had come knocking again. He already knew the mathematics. 10 trained soldiers, 4 days of preparation, terrain they understood better than anyone riding toward them. The numbers were brutal, but they were not impossible. That was not what the silence in the room was about. The silence was about something heavier. The question every man in that church was asking without saying it out loud. Were they willing to become soldiers again? Finally, Solomon lifted his head. He looked around the room, one face at a time. Men who had ridden beside him years earlier. Men who had buried friends beside him on distant plains. Men who had come here for the same reason he had, to stop fighting. He spoke one word. Yes. Nothing dramatic, no speech, just the decision. Flat, certain, final. The room changed immediately. Not because the danger was gone, because the direction was clear. Marcus Hale nodded once. Eli Pratt leaned back in the pew and exhaled. The others stood. War had returned, and they would meet it. The planning began that same night. Cyrus Boone took them to the mill first. A lantern, but kept it low, letting the shadows hide most of what they were doing. Greer's men will come down the main road, he said quietly. They'll head straight for the mill. He pointed to the approach path, 70 feet of narrow ground between the tree line and the outer wall, a natural corridor, perfect for cavalry, and perfect for something else. 5 firing positions, Cyrus said. Here, and here, and here. He tapped the wood of the mill wall, where subtle modifications had already been made months earlier. What the village had believed were simple repairs had actually been preparation. Cyrus had spent 3 years studying the ground around the mill, studying how men moved through it, studying how attackers would think. If they ride straight in, he said quietly, they'll funnel themselves. And once they do that, he let the sentence finish itself. The men around him understood the rest. Outside the mill, Coe Marsh stepped forward. Coe had been a scout on the frontier, a man who could read terrain like language. I'll take the road, he said. No explanation, no boasting, just a statement. Solomon nodded once. Everyone in that church knew what that meant. The road would not be the same road Greer expected. Assignments moved quickly after that. Marcus Hale would hold the western tree line. Eli Pratt would cover the flank. Cyrus Boone would command the mill corridor. Apprentice Wade would move between positions carrying ammunition. Absalom Price climbed the church steeple with his rifle. He had once been the best sharpshooter in the regiment. For 3 years he had preached scripture instead of aiming a weapon. Tonight he unwrapped the rifle he had kept hidden beneath cloth in the church storage room, checked it by feel, then climbed the ladder into the dark. Outside the village, the evacuation began. No lanterns, no shouting, just quiet movement into the swamp. 180 people. Children carried in arms. Old men walking slowly through marsh grass. Mothers holding hands in the dark. Miss Ida carried her trunk of books herself, through chest-deep water, because even now, she refused to abandon the future those books represented. By the time the moon rose higher over the Mississippi bottomland, Sorrows Bluff was dark, empty, silent, except for 10 men taking positions across the village, 10 former soldiers, waiting for 70 riders who believed they were coming to burn a helpless settlement. And far down the county road, torches were already moving through the night. Far down the county road, Aldous Greer's column rode with torches lit. 70 men, hooves striking the hard dirt in a rhythm that carried across the Mississippi bottomland like a drum. They were not hiding. Men who believe victory is guaranteed do not bother with silence. Greer rode at the front, straight-backed in the saddle, confident. He had spent 18 months preparing this night, maps drawn, scouts sent, routes studied. Every report had told the same story. Sorrows Bluff was just a village, farmers, a school, a mill. No weapons, no soldiers, no resistance. What Greer did not understand was that the village had been waiting for him since the moment the first tax letter arrived, and men who have time to prepare can turn land itself into a weapon. The first charge exploded at 9:47. The road ahead of Greer erupted with a crack that sounded like thunder tearing open the earth. 4 horses collapsed instantly, 2 riders thrown into the mud. The column behind them slammed forward in confusion as panicked animals collided in the narrow road. Men shouted, horses screamed, torches dropped into the dirt. Greer's instincts snapped in immediately. He yanked his horse back. "Hold the line!" Former cavalry officers know chaos when they see it. Explosions happen. Columns reorganize. The wounded are dragged aside, and the advance continues. He had done it before. But as the smoke cleared, something colder settled into the night. The road ahead was silent. No gunfire, no visible defenders, just darkness. The kind of darkness that feels like it is watching. Greer understood one thing immediately. The village knew they were coming. The hunt had changed. He reorganized the column and pushed forward anyway. The objective was the mill. Destroy the mill, and the village would collapse behind it. The riders entered the corridor at 10:15. 70 feet of narrow ground between the tree line and the mill wall. The exact path Cyrus Boone had predicted. The moment the first riders crossed the threshold, 5 rifles fired. Not wildly, not desperately, precisely. Each shot spaced, each shot deliberate. Men who had spent years in the United States Army understood a simple truth. Accuracy matters more than speed. The first volley dropped 3 riders before the others even understood where the fire had come from. The second volley struck as the horses tried to turn. Now the narrow corridor worked against them, animals crashing into each other, men trapped between walls and trees, targets held exactly where the defenders needed them. Greer shouted for a flank. Several riders pushed into the tree line on the left. They never made it 20 yards. Marcus Hale's position opened from the darkness. 2 fell instantly. Another staggered back to the road, bleeding. The attackers were beginning to understand. This was not a village defense. This was an ambush built by soldiers. Up in the church steeple, Absalom Price lay behind his rifle, breathing slow, letting the world shrink down to the circle of his scope. For 3 years he had been a preacher. Now his body remembered something older, the stillness before a shot. He tracked Greer first, the leader, then the rider beside him who kept relaying orders down the column. A competent man, dangerous, the kind of man who could reorganize panic into momentum. Absalom settled the crosshair over his chest, and then he froze. The rider turned slightly in the torchlight, just enough for Absalom to see his face. Thomas Price, his younger brother. For a moment, the battlefield disappeared. There was only memory. 2 boys standing beside a wooden fence years ago. One leaving home, one staying. A decade of distance. A war that had placed them on opposite sides of the same country. And now, opposite sides of the same rifle. Absalom lowered the weapon, pressed his back against the wooden steeple wall, closed his eyes. Because sometimes, the war does not stay in the past. Sometimes, it climbs the ladder with you. Below him, the fighting continued. At the village edge, Apprentice Wade moved through darkness, carrying ammunition between positions. 19 years old, too young for the weight this night had placed on his shoulders. He rounded a corner near the tree line, and nearly collided with a rider who had broken through the outer line. Both men froze. For half a second, neither moved. Then the rider lunged. The two crashed together in the mud. Close fighting is nothing like training. There is no order, no rhythm, only weight and breath and panic. Apprentice Wade remembered what Solomon had taught him. Keep moving, keep fighting, don't freeze. The fight ended quickly. The rider fell. Wade stood there shaking in the dark for a long moment, then picked up his rifle again, because the night wasn't finished. By 2:30 in the morning, the battle had shifted toward the marsh at the village edge. Greer himself had pushed forward with a handful of men trying to break through the final defensive line. That is where Solomon Gray met him. Chest-deep water, black mud under their boots. No witnesses except darkness. They collided almost immediately. Not strategy, not formation, just 2 men fighting in cold water where footing vanished and every breath mattered. Greer drove Solomon under once, then again. The marsh swallowed sound, swallowed movement, swallowed time. Up in the steeple, Absalom saw something through his scope. Solomon's head breaking the surface, and Thomas Price raising his rifle, aiming straight at him. 6 seconds. That was all the time the decision took. 6 seconds between recognizing his brother and saving the man who was keeping the village alive. Absalom exhaled, pulled the trigger. The rifle cracked across the marsh. Thomas Price collapsed beside the water. Solomon surfaced, and the night shifted again. Absalom climbed down from the steeple slowly. When he reached the church steps, they had already laid his brother there. He sat beside the body, placed the rifle across his knees, and held him until dawn. Out in the marsh, Solomon and Greer fought until only one of them remained standing. When it ended, Solomon walked out of the water alone. Behind him, the attackers began to break. One rider turned east, then 3, then 10, then the rest. Because the men who had come to burn Sorrows Bluff finally understood something terrible. They had not attacked a village. They had attacked soldiers who had chosen the ground. By 3:15 in the morning, the road was empty, and Sorrows Bluff was still standing. Dawn came slowly to Sorrows Bluff, the kind of gray morning light that makes everything feel both fragile and painfully real. Smoke drifted from two burned outbuildings at the edge of the village. The church still stood, the school still stood, and the mill still stood. Solomon Gray stood in the center of the village square, bare-chested, covered in marsh water and dried blood, wounds across his shoulders and ribs that had stopped bleeding but had not yet begun to close. He did not move. He simply stood there and breathed. Because sometimes surviving the night is its own kind of shock. 31 bodies lay scattered between the road and the marsh, men who had ridden in confident that 70 rifles would erase a village before dawn. Now their horses wandered riderless through the morning fog, and the men who survived were already miles away on the county road, riding east without looking back. Solomon turned when he heard footsteps behind him. The first people were returning from the swamp. Children carried in arms, women walking slowly through marsh grass with mud still clinging to their dresses, old men leaning on sticks. The entire village emerging from the darkness where they had hidden through the night. Miss Ida came first among them, still carrying her trunk of books. She set it down in the road and looked toward the church. For a long moment, she did not speak, because sometimes the survival of something fragile is too large to understand all at once. Solomon counted them as they returned, one by one, the way a sergeant counts his people after battle, not out of habit, out of necessity. Children, families, neighbors, every life accounted for. The number was right. The village had survived. But the defenders had paid for it. They found Apprentice Wade near the western edge just after sunrise. 19 years old, sitting in the mud with his rifle across his lap. A quiet expression on his face like a boy who had done everything asked of him and had finally grown too tired to keep doing it. The wound in his side had been hidden in the dark, bleeding slowly through the night. By the time they carried him to the church, there was nothing left to save. Solomon sat with him on the pew until the breathing stopped. He held the boy's hand and did not say anything, because there are moments when words only make grief smaller, and this grief deserved its full size. 3 other defenders had fallen at their positions, still holding the ground they had been assigned. Cyrus Boone walked through the mill at sunrise with a lantern and a small ledger in his pocket. He inspected every wall, every support beam, every firing slit he had built into the structure months before. The geometry had held, exactly the way he designed it. He made notes quietly in his book, because work was the only thing standing between him and the weight of what the night had cost. K.O. Marsh stood at the swamp's edge, watching the empty road long after the last rider disappeared. He did not celebrate. Men like K.O. Marsh understood something about violence. Victory never leaves a place clean. On the church steps, Absalom Price still sat with his brother in his arms. He had not moved since the moment he climbed down from the steeple. The rifle rested across his knees, his eyes fixed on nothing. Some battles end when the shooting stops. Others follow a man for the rest of his life. Sorrows Bluff buried its dead that afternoon, quietly, without speeches, without flags, because the people who lived there understood something about survival. Sometimes the most powerful victory is simply continuing. For 8 months, the village remained standing. Life returned. Fields were planted again. Children returned to Miss Ida's school. The mill resumed its slow, grinding rhythm. From the outside, it looked as though Sorrows Bluff had proven something important. that courage and discipline could protect what people built with their own hands. But the men who had ridden against the village had allies in places the defenders could not reach. Courthouses, tax offices, judges who never rode into the night themselves. 8 months after the battle, a ruling came down from the Yalobusha County Courthouse. A technical error in the land registration, a procedural mistake, a signature in the wrong place. Legal language that sounded polite and neutral, but carried the same outcome 70 rifles had failed to deliver. Sorrows Bluff's land titles were void. Solomon Gray read the notice twice, folded it carefully, placed it on the kitchen table. Then he walked through his house one final time, room by room, memorizing it, the way a man memorizes something he knows he will never see again. He built a small fire in the center of the floor, watched the flames take hold. Then he stepped outside, did not look back. The house burned behind him as he walked toward the swamp, and the Mississippi bottomlands swallowed him the same way it had swallowed countless men before him, quietly, without witnesses. That was the last official record of Solomon Gray in Yalobusha County. But Reuben Clay, the 19-year-old who had run through the swamp that night, lived a very long life. And he told the story the same way every time. 10 men held that village all night. 4 never walked out. The others disappeared before anyone could thank them. But they were there. I know because I ran 4 miles in the dark to tell them. And when they heard the warning, they stayed. Sometimes history records the men who burn things. Sometimes it records the judges who sign the papers. But the men who stand in the dark and refuse to move, those stories survive only when someone remembers to tell them. And Sorrows Bluff is one of those stories.